Hello, everybody. I'm not used to using this, so we'll see what happens. It's okay.
Me neither.
2 for 1 or 2 for 0, however it is. Welcome to the Norwich Bookstore. We have a few housekeeping duties to go through. Want to just let you know that the cookies tonight, every time we have a reading, 2 of our staff make cookies, and so we've given up the days of store-bought, running over to Danowitz at the last minute and getting some cookies. So now we've got really good homemade cookies, so I just want to let you know that. And turn off your cell phones. Anything that makes a noise, please. Want to just tell you a quick, brief, Liza keeps telling me to talk louder. Is that what you want? No? Okay. Yeah, hurry. The next 3 readers at the store over the next 3 weeks are all pretty local people. It's Always the Husband by Michelle Campbell, who is a new Thetford resident, and Bill Schubart, who you might hear on NPR, Vermont Public Radio, is reading on the 7th of June. And don't we wish Grace Paley would be here on the 14th, but we have the Grace Paley reader. For those of you who haven't seen this book, Nora Paley, Grace's daughter, and Kevin Bowen put this together. Yep, Barbara? You're very welcome. They put this wonderful collection together. It's not all of Grace's work, but it's an incredibly great choosing of her work. And so that's a night that we're going to be here and read pieces from this and just try not to burst into tears that we don't have Grace around anymore, but just celebrate Grace Paley. Tonight we get to celebrate Jeffrey Lent. Last time I introduced him 2 years ago, I did start to cry because I love books so much, but I'm under control tonight, I think. Not that I didn't love the book any less. I love all of Jeffrey's work. So Liza and I are very happy to once again welcome Jeffrey to the Norwich Bookstore. Before We Sleep is his 6th novel, and really luckily for his fans, we only had to wait 2 years since the publication of his last book, of Slant of Light, which I thought was an incredible book. As many of you may know, I've known him for so long, as well as his wonderful wife. And there's another person in the audience who worked with me at another bookstore a long time ago when we first met Marion and therefore met Jeffrey, before he was a published writer. We at the Norwich Bookstore believe that Jeffrey is one of the finest novelists writing today. He's a Vermonter and a neighbor living with his wife Marion and 2 daughters in Tunbridge. What we're going to do is we're going to do some questions and answers, or questions I'm going to ask and hopefully he's going to answer. And then Jeffrey's going to do a reading, and then we hope to have some time for audience members to ask questions. So, without further delay, how did you come to write this particular novel? I got a list.
There are a lot of reasons, but this is the second book in a 2-book contract, so I was envisioning it. Sound okay?
Turn it more to your mouth. Too low.
How about that?
You can hold it if you want.
So I was putting together this contract about 5-6 years ago. So this was the second book, and I had a vague idea for it. I heard my oldest daughter, who at that point was 13, 14 maybe, talking to her mother, and she said, "I wish just once I could read a book with 2 strong female protagonists." And I thought, I can do that. The second part is that I grew up, as many of you did, I'm sure, with parents who had been involved in World War II. And so our childhoods featured a great many vets and people who had gone through that traumatic experience. And everybody sort of knew You know, like there was the one guy that he's the father of a friend, and you knew that you didn't walk up behind him without whistling or chatting out loud or saying something. You didn't surprise this guy. That was just, you know, the word. And there were others too, of course. But so I've been thinking as that generation is dying off, I've been thinking about them a lot. The other kind of fortuitous part of it all was that my father's brother went to Germany in the 50s as a correspondent for Voice of America, and met and married a German woman who had been a girl during the war. And she sat down with me over the last few years and shared some pretty intense stories about the end of the war and the occupation, and some of the things that went on that aren't sort of part of our collective consciousness so much. So I kind of wanted to work with all of that stuff, although with what I just said, Kurt Vonnegut did it with Slaughterhouse-Five years and years ago brilliantly. So that's kind of how I came to write this.
One of the things that really gets me in some novels is when the author doesn't get the details right. It really ticks me off when I'm reading a book about Vermont and the author mentions a flower blooming in March when, darn it, I know it can't bloom in March. And your details are always, I think, obviously you've thought them out or you've researched them or something. I'm just curious about how you go about doing that.
I pay attention. I mean, that's a glib answer, but I do. And I also don't try to write about places that I haven't spent time. Mostly. Some things you can sort of pull together out of the imagination, but for deep, in-depth sort of knowledge of land and customs and all of that, you have to have spent time there. A weekend doesn't do it. I wrote a novel that's half set in Amsterdam, and we spent a month in Amsterdam in an apartment, which doesn't sound like a lot of time, but it is enough. You establish daily routines, where you shop, what you shop for, where the laundry is, all these things, to give you a sense of the life of a place. So that's really important also.
Well, that book actually was a great book about place. So obviously you got the place, you got that.
Yeah.
You did well with that.
Well, I was there for that reason too, so I was paying attention again.
But what about, like, in this book, music?
Music plays a huge role in this book. The husband, the returned vet, comes from a long line of French-Canadian fiddle players, and he returns from the war and doesn't really want to take part in the family business, doesn't want to interact with people, and so he starts, totally by accident, but this little business repairing fiddles. So I had to learn about that, and again, just enough. You know, I didn't want to write a manual about how to repair fiddles. So that's the first part. And then the second part is the daughter's story. Except for one chapter, the chapters alternate between a mother and a daughter. And the daughter's story all takes place in June of 1967. And I had a lot of fun trying to figure out what year and how far into the 60s to go with her. Of course, she's a small town girl from rural Vermont, so her ideas had mostly come through magazines and television and the radio, through music. And that was the stuff that really spoke to her. The images she saw, the stories she read about the counterculture and the anti-war protesters and the civil rights movement, that was all fascinating to her, but the music, like any teenager, was speaking deeply to her. And then, because I was still going back and forth with years, just checking out when specific things happened, and I found this website that showed the top 100 albums from each year. And I looked at 1966, and it was a dynamic mix of pop and rock and folk and jazz and easy listening music. And then I went to 1967, and it was rock and roll. It was all rock and roll. It was like, you know, the 100 classic albums that anybody would own from 1967 were there. So that made that pretty easy to, you know, settle on that time period.
How did you come up with 67? I hadn't thought about that until just now.
Well, I just explained it.
No, but I mean, but I assume you didn't come up with the music first, so when you're
Well,
deciding...
I didn't want to go, by 68, by 69, things were changing. I mean, the whole national temperament was changing. In 67, rural Vermonters were still pretty conservative. They were still pretty much supporting the war. The local boys were still going off to fight. You know, there wasn't resistance. There wasn't, you know, that was something that was happening in pockets by weirdos that nobody understood. You know, but really rapidly, by 68, it became a much more widely questioned thing. So that was, again, that was a big part of it, was just getting that timing right. I didn't want to have to deal too much with the politics. It was already a big enough challenge writing about the 60s, because the 60s, even those of us who remember parts of it, we still see it now through a layer of cliche, you know, and that whole time period is viewed through layers and layers of cliche. And I wanted this naive, smart, sensitive 17-year-old girl to be going out into this world and experience things as they came to her. So that was part of that effort also.
Okay, so this is my favorite question. The authors that I really love have what I call a voice. You know what I mean by having a voice. Reynolds Price comes to mind. You totally have a voice. And I'm curious about if you know you have a voice, and also how does that happen? I don't understand. I don't get it. How does that happen?
You know, this is really an interesting question, because there's a glib answer which really gets to.
I don't want it.
Well, it gets to. It's that the glib answer is I see visions and I hear voices, and the reality behind that is that I literally have to be seeing the scene. And my characters have to be speaking. If I'm trying to find lines for them to say, that's not working. Now the mystery, not with the dialogue, but with the descriptive passages, or these things I'm seeing, is I still don't, honestly, I don't really fully understand the process that translates into language and down my fingers into the keyboard, you know. It just kind of, you get going and you're seeing it and finding the words that capture what you're trying to say.
So do you agree with me that a lot of authors don't have this voice?
Some do it better than others.
Okay.
And I think the other thing is, you know, I don't know about you, but you get gentler as you get older, don't you?
Hopefully.
Different people like different books, and different writers and different types of books serve readers at different times. You know, I have no embarrassment about admitting that there are specific days or weeks when all I really want to read is thrillers. You know, they steal my time because I can't put them down. But, you know, I'm just not in the mood to read serious literature, you know. And then there are other times when that's what I really need, that's what I want. So you know, I guess I'm pretty generous that way. You know.
Do you read while you're writing? A lot of authors say that they don't read at all when they're writing.
Bullshit. If they tell you that, they're lying.
So you do? And anything? I mean,
Because you can't, look, you can write a couple of hours a day, okay? Of like solid concentration. And you can edit the previous day's work for a couple of hours. That leaves a big block of time, which you can indeed spend snowshoeing or hiking or gardening or cooking or doing all the stuff of life that has to be done. But if your whole central core revolves around language, you want to be involved with language. Whether that's reading fiction or reading the New York Review of Books or poetry, you know, it all feeds in. Also, you know, I just have to say that we're also magpies. We steal, and like I came across a term, it's still in my head, I haven't used it yet, but a British writer, Tim Pears, described a certain light as cidery. And I was like, oh, that's sweet. You know, I knew exactly what he was talking about. So, you know, there's that also, that you read, and it's not necessarily using that word, it's just prompting you to think about things in different ways. That's one of the reasons that I love poetry, is that poetry never gets in the way of my fiction. I never despair and throw the book down and say, oh my God, why am I even bothering? You know, it just juices me up, so.
that's great. That leads me to the next question, which is, what are your thoughts about the fiction and the poetry that's coming out of primarily northern New England? The writers, the poets?
Well, I've been thinking about this. It started in a series of conversations, really that started last fall, although they've been going, I first met Howard Frank Mosier in 2000, and Howard and I became very close friends, and spent a lot of time talking on the phone and writing back and forth, and always showed up at each other's events and stuff like that, just because we really liked each other. And last fall, Howard called me one day, and he said, Jeffrey, do you think I'm a sociopath? A sociopath. And I said, no, Howard, I don't. Why? He said, well, I just love all this weird shit, you know? And I write all these dark things, and it worries me. I said, no, I think that, you know, you have a tremendous sense of humor, but you're also writing, and this is where this was literally the germ. I said, you're writing out of a place that has always had strange and interesting characters. And at the same time, I was reading Stacy Schiff's wonderful new book about Salem. I think it's called Witches. And it reframed for me the whole Puritan experience in southern New England, and what that was like, which was it was a terrifying thing. I mean, it was not fun being a Puritan. It was a constant. I mean, it was constant self-questioning and self-doubt and worry about eternal damnation and Satan, and you know, it was all around you. It wasn't just this little blip that happened with the witchcraft stuff. It was an ongoing 200 years of bizarre stuff, including the unknown of northern New Hampshire, all of Vermont, Maine, Canada, which is where the barbarians, which were either Indians or French Catholics, same thing, barbarians, would sweep down out of at any moment and destroy your life. So that was a place of the unknown and of fear. And so I think it kind of tracks back to that a little bit. And then, of course, the people that started settling up into Vermont and northern New Hampshire were often, well, they were the second sons or the third sons, and or people who had failed where they'd been. So there was plenty of strangeness going on. I came across a very early short story of Nathaniel Hawthorne's, published in 1842, I believe. He was very young, so you can forgive how bad the story actually is. But it's about a young man who's traveling through one of the notches, either Crawford or Franconia, and gets trapped for the night at a house there. There's a family there. It's never explained why they're living there, but they live in fear of avalanches, stone avalanches coming down out of the notch. The young man is totally focused on wanting to make his mark on the world. And the grandmother of the family says, oh, to live a good life is all that's the important thing. And they've got a safe place that's outside the house. It's constructed in case of one of these events. And of course, there's an avalanche and everybody gets killed and covered up, and no one even knows that the young man had been there. So he's completely lost to history. So his ambition is also completely lost. Bad story, but weird, right? Okay. And then I started thinking about like some of the poems of Robert Frost, The Witches of Coos, Home Burial. Again, really strange, odd characters and situations. So I just started thinking about that and talking with Howard about that, sort of continuing in that tradition, without even realizing that that's what we were doing. I think consciously, just knowing we were in a place that was rich with stories. Even then, enlarging this a little bit and including, our tremendous contemporary master of horror, Stephen King, who grew up and lives not in coastal Maine, not where the rich folks go. He's up in central Maine, in a pretty poor part of the state. So anyway, I just was thinking about that a little bit, about the freedom to write about the strange and that sort of stuff.
It makes me think about Southern novels, which are often strange. I was just sitting here trying to think of other parts of the country that I could label.
Well, we in a sense, we are Northern Appalachia. And I think about this because I go to Mississippi, and people are like, my friends and neighbors are often like, why would you go to Mississippi? That's like the worst place on earth. And in many ways it is. It's always at the bottom or the top of the bad lists, right?
Except for a couple of very good bookstores.
Except for some really good bookstores. And there's a deep literary culture there. And I've been thinking, and William Faulkner was like a mule kick to the head when I was 20 years old, And I got thinking about this in relation to what I was just talking about. That part of the Deep South was also some of the last settled land by white settlers, or white and their African slaves. And it was tremendously inhospitable country to go into. If you've ever been in the Delta in May, you can't imagine what it was like when people first came in there. It was impenetrable, jungly forest. It was 99 degrees and 1,000% humidity, and bugs and snakes, and anyway. Those are some tough folks who made that trek, and made that journey. So I see parallels there. And the other reason, I'm just going to do this.
Go.
The other reason I really like going to Mississippi is those bookstores, they hold events at 5 o'clock. And then they take you out to dinner. And then they take you to a party.
bar.
Or a bar, or to hear a band, or all of those things.
Liza, we've got to get our change everything.
So it's just kind of fun, you know. It makes putting up with the heat. I'm going down in August this year, which is the first time I've been there in August. That's just, I'm a little freaked out about that. I get cranky when it hits 80 degrees, you know. So.
But you're also going to Martha's Vineyard to a festival, right?
Yes, the week before. So.
I wish I could do this with everybody that comes. It's so much fun to get down deep. Before we let you read to us for a while, I would love to know if you're willing to talk to us about what you're working on now.
No.
That's okay. Most people say, blah, 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 and some say no. So, all right.
So,
Will you read to us?
Yeah.
Right.
I'd like to stand, though.
Go for it.
See if we can make this work. See, I don't know if I can do this, actually. Yeah. Don't you have a technical assistant?
Yeah, she's standing in the back of the room there. I could stand there and hold it for you.
I gotta be able to see.
Got the sun right on you.
That works, actually. So let me see here. Is that close enough so you can hear me? Okay. Okay. As I said earlier, this book is divided mostly between chapters of between the mother and the daughter. What's the matter?
No, the mic's not working, or it's not too, not
No,
close.
you
Not
can
to your face,
pull it
it's
up.
because of- yeah.
That's his family.
This book alternates chapters between the mother and the daughter, with one exception. There's one chapter that the father, and these are all third-person narratives, but they are the principal narrators for the chapters. And I'm going to read actually from Oliver's chapter. This is about 1955 in Vermont in the fall, and I just want to really try to get this right before I read. And it's just a passage that I kind of like, and nothing dramatic happens. It's just what it is. I just don't know if this is
And now
going
you
to
gotta
work.
hold it up.
All right, let's give it a whirl. In her 5th November, he drove one afternoon of watery light up into the hills beyond the Williamstown Gulf. The trees bare limbed, but for the curled coppery beech leaves they would hold through the winter. The balsams and hemlock needles a dark oily green, the sun pale behind thin clouds, low in the west. The truck heater threw the faint tang of old mouse droppings, and the radio was turned low to country and western songs. Katie was bundled in a corduroy jacket, jeans tucked into rubber boots against the frozen rutted mud, her honey brown hair pulled back in a high ponytail. Dirty pink mittens dangled from their strings from her jacket cuffs. She was singing very low along with the radio, not the words of the songs, but her own words, too faint for him to make out. He was used to this, much as she was used to being bundled into the truck for excursions. She was not a child to pester asking about their destination, but content simply to ride, having done so since earliest memory. They passed some other few trucks and cars, with men in wool pants and coats, hunting rifles, now and then with a buck in the bed or lashed over a fender. The sound of gunfire cutting across the stark land. He watched her as he drove, as he often did, his eyes almost furtive with love. This afternoon, watching more cautiously, wondering, as he seldom bothered to, how she would respond at their journey's end. She was still young enough, a year away from starting school, that he hadn't yet begun to watch her and think of himself in the moment, or herself in the moment. She was simply there, along with him, as she had been all of her life. There wasn't so much of a driveway as simply the road widening off to one side, a couple of old cars, neither running, before the low one-story house, the sway-backed barn. The side of the barn hung with traps of all sizes. A pair of big hounds, some part red bone, some black and tan, showing in both of them, stood at the end of chains and roared at his truck. A pack of beagles swarmed out of the barn and also stood, their baying surprisingly deep for such small dogs. "I think those dogs are more bark than bite," he said. "But why don't you let me get out first?" "All right." She was looking at the dogs. As he came down out of the truck, the door to the house swung inward and a man stepped out and stuck a pair of fingers into his mouth and whistled, and the pack of dogs went silent. The big hounds sat on their haunches, the chain still stretched tight, watching. "Hey, Cap, it's Oliver Snow here," he called. Cappy Levesque wore stained wool pants that at least one owner ago had been part of a suit, a pair of flannel shirts buttoned one over the other, colors muted with wear and wood smoke. His gray and black hair was worn long and pulled back behind his ears, touching the collars of his shirts. He peered, setting one hand scout-like above his eyes to shade from the weak sunlight. "I can see," he said. "Your little girl, she up in the cab there?" "Yep." Bring her in. What you want, you?" Oliver walked forward and shook hands, nodding. Then as he turned back to the truck and lifted Katie onto his hip, he said, "I'll tell you, Cappy, I was looking for a pair of snowshoes, and I came to think of you." "Oh, I don't make 'em no more. Them folks up at Tubbs, they got their big steamers and use pre-cut everything. I got work enough come the winter." He leaned toward Katie and smiled bright white dentures at her and said, "And you, Missy? How you be this pretty afternoon?" "I'm fine, thank you." She was wide-eyed, and her hand clenched tight to Oliver's coat. Cappy said, "Your papa there. Tell him to come on in the house and we figure out this snowshoe business, okay?" Then he leaned to Oliver and winked and said, "I got me a litter of beagle pups, tickle her pink. Come on." As they went through the door, Cappy said, "Your snowshoes busted or what? I could make new bindings, that's what you need. But why don't you just get them from Tubbs? You get the wholesale anyhow, don't you?" The kitchen was warm from an old flat-topped logging camp stove and smelled of smoke, wood, and tobacco, and man, and a braid stream of other odors, the tang of urine underneath all, from the scents and lures the man cooked up himself to use on his trap lines. A pot of stew simmered gently on the back of the stove, and Oliver guessed once it was cool enough to keep the fire going, the pot likely never emptied, but was replenished with meat and root vegetables throughout the winter. He set Katie down, and she stood there, now gripping his pant leg. From a nest of blankets beside the stove came a low growl, and then puppies came bursting across the floor. She went down on her knees, and the puppies scrambled over her legs and lap, her hands floating among them as she leaned down, and they lifted to lick her face, and then one nipped, and she jerked up, and the nipper tried to scramble up the front of her coat. She reached and plucked the puppy up and turned it sideways in her hands and held it against her cheek. Levesque said, "There, she's set now." Oliver pointed his chin at her and said, "I was thinking about a small pair of snowshoes. Tubbs, the smallest they make is the bear paw. And I remember as a boy wearing those and struggling through the snow, and most all I got was cold and miserable. I quit 'em for years. I was hoping to start her off better." "You want a good crust of snow. But hold on, let me see. There's something to the barn they ain't rotted or mouse chewed." Beside the door was a row of pegs hung with wool jackets and sweaters, a mackintosh, a pair of hip boots, and various caps and hats. He took down a blue toque with white snowflakes around the rim, pulled it on, and went out into the day. "Daddy?" He turned. "Yes, Bee." She was struggling to stand, a beagle puppy the color of deer hide, with one black ear, the black patch crossing over the crown of its head and down its nose, clutched in her hands. He reached for her elbow and she came up as she said, "I want him, Daddy. I want him so bad." He thought, "Oh, a hound. He'll break your heart." But said, "I didn't hear Mr. Levesque say anything about their being for sale. How do you know it's a him?" He peed on my jacket. "Well, that's not a very promising start, is it now? What would Mom say?" "She'd say he's just a puppy and was excited." "Would she now?" She was looking at him, blinking slowly, very serious. "I think so." "It's about winter. It's not a good time to get a pup, the snow and all. But he's here now." Levesque came back through the door. He was carrying a pair of very old, small snowshoes, the shape of teardrops, with fine, delicate lacing. "Who's here? Me?" He looked at Katie and said, "Oh, I see. You found the right one? Daddy said they might not be for sale." "You wait a minute, you," Levesque said. He held out the snowshoes to Oliver, who took one in each hand and turned them over, looking at them. Levesque said, "You get your deer?" Oliver said, "No. I went a couple of times as a boy and it didn't take." "You get yours?" "Oh yeah, I got mine all right," and shot his eyes away the briefest of moments. Cappy Levesque ate deer meat year-round, as did a number of dairy farmers and others up in the hills. Contrary to rumor, the meat in his winter stew never came from the fur-bearers he trapped, although he swore by young woodchucks fat with spring grass. He looked back to Oliver and said, "Those pretty things, they do the job, you think?" "They're lovely, but so old they must be worth a fortune." Levesque shook his head. "They're only worth being used. They come down to me. Now I pass them along. But that babiche, that's moose. You don't be putting no shellac or nothing like that on it, you hear?" Oliver ran his fingers over the delicate lacing. "It's so dry, though." "Yup, but sound. You got bear grease?" Oliver almost laughed. "No," he managed, "I don't have bear grease." "I didn't think so." He pulled a Prince Albert tobacco tin from his back pocket and palmed it over. "There's enough here, get you through a couple of winters." Oliver tucked both snowshoes under one arm and reached for the tin. As he took it, Levesque held his eye and said, "But you run out. Good clean lard works fine, just fine." And he grinned. That's good to know," Oliver said, and grinned also. Throughout this, Katie had stood with the puppy cradled between her chest and left arm, her right hand running over the tawny, fine teacup of dog's skull, waiting. Levesque swiveled to her now and said, "Your papa, he's right. Them pups ain't for sale." "Oh." She didn't move. "They damn? Mama dog? She my best rabbit dog. They sire? He my second best. The rest of that pack out there barking at you, they're all worthless. I'd drown them if I didn't have such a soft heart. That's how bad they be. So these pups here, they gon' get me back in the rabbit fur business. That's how it is. So no, they ain't for sale. But I'm thinking," his voice trailed, and he scuffled one hand over his face as if chasing a thought. "What?" she said, unable to help herself. "Well," he said, "that little booger you got there, he all the time be pestering me, biting at my ankles, my pant cuffs, trying to climb up me when I'm sitting in the chair. That's a problem, see?" Her face was screwed with puzzlement. "Yep, that's not a good sign. You hounds, you want him to be thinking about other things than you. You ain't looking for a pal and you hound. You want the hound to be thinking rabbit all the time. It's true. All you be good for is to feed 'em. That's all they think of you. And when you come out with the little .22 rifle, they know that mean rabbit. You see? That one you got there, he worthless is what I think. He gonna want to sleep on the bed, follow you to school, that sort of thing. You be sitting down and go to sleep on your foot. Oh no. Now he might, you go in the field, the woods with him, he might holler and chase off after the cottontail. He might. But you know what else he gonna be doing? She waited, and then cautious, not sure if she should speak, not sure what charm was being spun, ventured, what? Why, he gonna keep turning around to make sure you chasing right behind him. Yes, ma'am. That's what I see there, that pup. So no, he ain't for sale, worthless like that. But you take him home, take care of him like you will. He gonna be a fine little dog just for you. You hear? Oh my, she said. You mean it? Well, yes, I do. I think so. But you forget one thing, ain't you? I did. You got to ask your papa to be all right with him. She looked at Oliver. After a moment, he said, we can discuss the rules on the ride home, but I think it will really help with Mom if you had a name for him before we get there. She'll be home from school. Tinker, she said. I'm going to call him Tinker. Now there, Cappy Levesque said. A good name, that one. Katie said, Daddy's always tinkering with something. What Mom says.
See what I mean about the voice? Thank you, Jeffrey.
So, let's see. How's that? All right.
Questions, please. Come on. Come on. You there in the second row.
Why don't you narrate? Yeah. Why don't you narrate your books? Why is that not an option? You read, okay.
Jeffrey, can
I'm
you,
serious.
wait.
Nice to hear your
Wait. Could you just repeat the question because not everybody heard it?
I was asked why I don't narrate the
Books on tape.
recorded book.
Oh, yes, that's what I meant.
It's really not a process that I'm interested in. It takes a long time. You're not tremendously well compensated for it, and it's something that, I mean, it really does take a long time to do it. It takes a long time to read something aloud, and every time you do that, they have to back up and start again, and it's just not something that, you know, has ever appealed to me. So I think I've told you that before, but I'm not sure.
I made her ask, or somebody ask a question.
I always ask writers who they like to read.
Who does, question was, who does Jeffrey like to read? What authors?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. I mean,
Well, this week.
this week. A lot of it's really kind of, some of it's just, you know, what's happening. Like I just read The Underground Railroad, just a magnificent book. You know, that was another one of those that I read and didn't feel a bit of jealousy. I was just so delighted that it was out there in the world. I really like Marilyn Robinson's Gilead and Lila. For some reason, the middle book, I just can't penetrate it. So it's just the way that works. I really like the poet Anne Carson. Her work, I just go back to and find new things. She's so strange anyway, that you find something new every time you dig into her work. And then, as I said, just, you know, like what comes to me, you know, what comes, so sometimes it's what comes in the mail, sometimes it's what shows up in one of my local libraries. what I read about in the New York Review of Books or the TLS or something like that, and then I track down, like the Stacy Schiff book that I mentioned earlier, the Salem book, is just wonderful. And I was a little skeptical about it. I don't know why. I think that maybe a lot of us have some fatigue with the whole idea of the Salem witchcraft trials, and I just wasn't sure that I wanted to revisit that with 400 pages, and it was fabulous. So,
Do you read much nonfiction?
probably about a quarter of my reading is nonfiction. History, biography, those are the two big ones for me. Yes, what?
Judy.
I read in the fall when it first came out, and was just totally swept away by becoming part of that world. And so now it's curious to me. I'm curious about how, that was the first thing you published, or was the first success?
Yes, first published.
So I'm curious, how much rejection of how many different manuscripts had you had before that? And then, how would you describe the change that happened to you as that success became clear?
Did people hear that? Oh, boy. Judy asked about in the fall and wondered if there had been many rejections before he published In the Fall, which was Jeffrey's first published novel. And then how has I don't know if it's the fame that grew out of that book has changed him, or is that? Okay.
There's two parts, so I'll start with the first. There were, I think, 4 apprentice novels before that, 2 of which almost got published, both of which I'm really grateful did not. But the second of those 2, it secured me my agent, and we'd run through all the major presses, and she was talking to me about maybe it was time to go to smaller presses or things like that, and I said, no, I don't want to do that. And that was a fairly slender 250-page novel, sort of what I felt like the market was looking for. And I'd started another one kind of in a similar vein. And she said to me, well, I think that's a smart decision, and I'm sure whatever you're working on now is just going to wow them. And I got off the phone with her and I thought, that's not going to wow anybody, it's not even wowing me, And so I had a conversation with my lovely wife and said, I'm going to write the big book that I've been holding off, until I felt like I was ready for it. And she said, good. So I did. And that was there was really some transformation that went on with that process. When I talked earlier about seeing and hearing my story, that's when that really started to happen. So I think it was just like a maturation of my own creative process that went through, it took me those earlier books to get to. As far as how it changed me, I don't know, that's like 17 years now, so life tosses you up and down and all around. There's feast, there's famine, there's all of that stuff. It's not a trajectory that just keeps going up. So, but it was fun.
Jane, you had your hand up.
You referred to a maturation process. It said that you had early novels. I'm curious how many years, I assume years, that maturation process was, those 4 novels.
The question was how many years was the, quote, maturation process?
10 or 11. I'd written a couple of novels or parts of novels in college, and then when I was out of college, I was in my early 20s, and I was working in restaurants and doing this and that, and I was writing a lot of poetry because you can write a poem. In theory, you can write a poem in an afternoon. I made a couple of attempts to get back into longer fiction, but it was too early. I wasn't ready. And then I met my wife, and I was still writing poetry, but my poems started getting longer and longer, and I realized it was time to go back to the long form. I also knew that it's virtually impossible to make a living as a poet. It's also virtually impossible to make a living as a novelist, but I didn't know that then, you know, so I thought I stood a better chance writing novels. So.
Jane in the back row there.
When you finish a manuscript, you send it off to your editor, you can't do anything else to it. Do you take a break from writing, or are you on to the next project?
Okay, wait, hang on a second. Question being, when he finishes his manuscript and sends it off and that's it, does he take a break, or does he just dive back into the next thing?
Well, the first part of that is waiting to hear back from the editor and what their ideas are about what further work needs to be done. So there's generally some tinkering and some time involved in that. Once that process is done, I pretty much am ready to start something new, unless, of course, life intervenes. Penny mentioned that it was 2 years ago that my last novel came out, and I've been producing about every 2 years, and then I had about a 6-year kind of dry zone. So that happens too. Life just works that way.
I guess I was wondering if you have this like necessary fallow time, where you've spent yourself, you've birthed this story, and then do you need a recharge for your brain, or are you working on the next thing while you're finishing up the first thing, or you have ideas that have been percolating and you can't wait to get to it, or do you need that time off?
I generally work every day. And if things are going well, once you start a novel and you've got a clear sense of, the storyline, you're also kind of locking yourself into not just a story, but a mentality, the information you can bring to that particular story, depending on, the parameters of it, and also your own life experience up to that point. But in the couple of years that you're producing this, you continue to grow and think and experience things, and there's always ideas for what comes next, and so part of that is the genuine curiosity to find out what you've learned, what's going to change. And then the other part of it is that I really don't like to take breaks, because writing is something that if you do it every day, it flows better. If I have an event like tonight, I didn't write this afternoon, so it'll probably be a rocky start tomorrow. And not much got done yesterday because I was all worried about the inevitable break. So one day off equals 3. This is why and friends will attest to this. I swear to God I'm coming to your party and I don't show up, and I think another part of it is that I grew up on a dairy farm, and the cows get milked every day. Christmas morning, they get milked before Christmas morning happens, so that kind of, I've taken some breaks, like the month in Amsterdam I didn't write, and some other times I've traveled, and that's always nice, but it's planned, it's like, it comes at a particular point. It's the inadvertent breaks that I really don't like. It's a pain in the ass having teenagers, you know, they want you to do stuff. They interfere with my schedule all the time.
Any other questions? Yes?
I was wondering whose picture that is on the cover.
I have no idea.
Oh.
It's a picture the art director found, and we all just kind of fell in love with it. So this is literally the only book that I've not gone through multiple attempts to get the right cover image. We just really liked it.
Do you have a movie option on any of your books?
No, not at present.
What was that?
A movie option on any, none.
I know that that's supposed to be a great thing, but these books are meant to be read. I don't want to take away millions of dollars from your.
Oh, no. No, if I'm approached, I will happily take the check. I'll probably not go to the movie, but, you know, I will very happily take the check. If you know anybody in the business, feel free to pass my work along.
All you need is the option, right? You get the money for that. The
Right.
movie doesn't have to get made.
Yeah. Because the writer never gets any of that, you know. It's like, they'll promise you things like points.
Anything, anybody else? One more here. Yes.
So I remember we were talking about an author. I don't remember which one. I do. I'm just not gonna say it. But we were talking about why some male authors have trouble writing women, and I don't think that you do. But why do you think that it is so hard for certain male authors to do that, when in theory those male authors are surrounded by at least one woman at one point, maybe? Like, what do you think it is?
You know, I don't know. I think most writers, whether they're male or female, can write well of both. Because we spend our lives either studying the opposite sex or being the opposite sex. I mean, you know, I think it's maybe passing a little bit, but certainly some 20th century male writers had very strange ideas about women, which made it difficult for them to depict them accurately. And I can share this, I'm pleased you didn't, but the writer we were talking about actually was Cormac McCarthy, who I think is absolutely brilliant and has not written a single convincing female character. Writes other stuff really, really well, but he just can't do that. So, you know.
Jeffrey, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming.